Well, great. We are once again in the dining room of the Landrieux on South Prior Street with Moon Landrieu, mayor of New Orleans, who began his 8-year term in 1970 and was on center stage in the decade that we're mostly talking about in this oral history project at Loyola. I'm Jack Davis, asking a few questions, and with me is Justin Nystrom, Loyola history professor. Last time, Mr. Mayor, we talked mostly about the origins of your attitudes towards race and your determination to make a difference in changing things. And we covered a lot of 20th century at that time, and we got ourselves up to roughly the mayor's race of 1969. And what I was hoping to do today was talk about that and the runoff election, and then talk about how you shaped an administration and used your position as mayor to do the things that you wanted to do particularly in the area of racial relations and making them better and eliminating the discrimination that you described the last time we talked. So the election in 1969 featured white candidates in which the decisive factor turned out to be the black vote.
Well, I don't think there's any question that that was the decisive factor. Race played a huge part in it. I think I got about 95% in the second primary of the black vote. But it wasn't only that. Race was a factor in it, but not in a very outspoken way. It's always difficult to put in some kind of context. Yes, it played a part, but there were many, many other factors. If you would take a look at the advertising of that campaign,
Right.
The major theme of our campaign was, can a man who tells the truth win? That the times are difficult. David Kleck, who was our PR man, came up with this idea of a theme because of the record he thought that I had of confronting difficult issues squarely and speaking openly to them. There was the Madison Report in 1966, which pointed out the city was going bankrupt unless we made some radical changes. We spoke last time, I think, of the concept of an income tax or earnings tax, which we did when I was a councilman. That was under Mayor Skiro, and people chose the sales tax rather than income tax. And then in the mayor's campaign, one of the issues we had was whether or not to impose an earnings tax on people working within the city and not. There were the issues of the expressways and traffic and the normal building issues. I remember let me go back before we getting ahead of myself. When the campaign started, the polls showed that Councilman Fitzmaurice, who was a terrific guy and a great friend of mine, I'd run on Jimmy's ticket in 1966 when he lost narrowly to Mayor Skiro. And I was elected, as was Philip Ciascio, on Jimmy's ticket, but Jimmy himself lost the mayor's race in a very close election. 4 years later, Jimmy decided to run again. I was in a posture where I either had to run for mayor or to get out of politics because of many things in my life and my law practice. And in addition, in that campaign, there was Billy Gust, who was a state senator and a very prominent name, the owners of Antoine's and a very distinguished family. The father was, Mr. Gust, was the chairman of the Housing Authority, or attorney for the Housing Authority, which had done really very good work for the black community in providing for housing. Judge David Gertler, who was a fairly substantial figure in the political arena before he became judge. And Councilman John Petrie, who was my counterpart on the city council, was a councilman at large and from the 7th Ward, different section of the city from which I came. And he had been on the council as senator before that time, and then we had a school board member who was president of the school board. I forget his name right now, but he had gone through the desegregation crisis of the school board. Then there were another 6 people who were kind of fringe candidates, some of them. I mean, there was Dan Dial, who traveled on a bicycle with badges all over him and all over his bicycle, and there was a taxi cab driver who was staunchly right-wing, conservative, nothing but racial politics. And then Miss Pizzo, who was kind of an erratic person, used to sit in council chambers all the time and yell out. And also there was another candidate, was not entirely a fringe candidate. He was a captain on the New Orleans Police Department, but he didn't have really a political base. So there were 13 of us in that race. And I think maybe most famously was Dan Dial, whose single campaign pledge was to get a gorilla for the zoo.
Rodney Fertel.
Not Dan Dial.
Right.
I think Dan was the other candidate who was on the bike. And I'm not chuckling at that, but that was what he was running on, and fulfilled the promise. Might have been the only guy that totally fulfilled the promise after he wasn't elected. So the issues were all over the place.
And the phrase "the man who tells the truth," that was referring largely to city finances.
Well, to that and to race also.
Yeah. How did it get interpreted as a racial?
Well, I can't tell how people interpret anything. It wasn't entirely that. Clearly, I had come through the state legislature in 1960 and gotten to be known as Moon the Coon, and I'd spoken pretty openly about racial injustice and racial unfairness. I wasn't a sword-wielding, vibrant racial reformer in that sense.
So when people heard the phrase "a man who tells the truth," they were applying it to racial matters as well as other matters.
Well, I suppose it applied to everything. I think its greatest implication, I think, was on the finances. But the fact that we were a divided city, we had to confront a growing population who were being treated very unfairly and who could not contribute fully to the development of the city. I think I might have said in the previous interview, when you have a city with 50% black, who are not participating and not contributing, not because they don't want to contribute, but they are prevented from contributing to the overall well-being of the city to the extent that they could, because they have no business position, no social position, no economic strength. And what a waste of talent, what a waste of ability, what a waste of energy. And if the city wanted to progress, we simply had to get over this Jim Crow thing with the whites owning the city and the blacks being paupers and eating hand-downs rather than earning their way, which they wanted to do, but were being prevented from doing it.
Was that overtly stated as a campaign
Not
issue?
exactly in that way, no.
How did
No,
it get?
listen, you could not, you had to walk these issues with some care. As I pointed out in an earlier thing, I went from the defensive position of the legislature in 6 years in 1960 to where I could object, I could make a speech, but couldn't get anything done. When I became a city councilman, then I believed I could move on a more affirmative posture. However small the steps were, having the first black say a prayer at the council meeting, removing the Confederate flag from the chamber. These are small victories, as hiring the first black city staff person on the city council. I had no control over the mayor's office or civil service, or not that anybody controlled civil service other than the commission, but the power rested with the mayor. But as a councilman, I certainly had whatever limited power I had, I could, if I thought on a regular basis, how can we move the ball further? One of the big steps, of course, was the public accommodations law, which we passed when I was council president. So those steps were taking place. Now, that does not mean that all of a sudden in 1966, when I got elected councilman, there was a eureka and the world had changed automatically. It didn't. I mean, Mayor Skiro had a black assistant in City Hall. There were, I think, 10% of the population of the workforce were black, but they were all at very low jobs. There was nobody in position of policy making or authority. But nonetheless, they were there, and I suspect in Chet Morrison's days there was a token here or there in a low-level position. There were a few policemen, black policemen on the force. Fact is, there was a captain, I recall, that ultimately made, I think it was Sidney Cates, I'm not exactly sure. Not Sidney, you gotta forgive me and correct this history. I made a deputy under Clarence Geruso, so I moved him up from captain to a deputy chief. There were 3 deputy chiefs, and one of them was black. Now that was historical in a sense. So you could make those things as mayor, but you were not dealing from zero. Maybe you were dealing from 3%, 5%, 10%. Now the question was, how do we get this thing done on a more full-scale basis?
Can I interrupt
Yeah,
you
sure.
at that point? Could we talk about how you got into office? Just first, how did you, of 13, if there's 13 candidates, all white, correct? How do you get into? How do you get to be one of the 2 people in the runoff election?
Well, I remember.
And how did the racial interpretation of your record feed into that?
As I recall, there was a poll that was taken that everybody accepted as true, no reason to believe that it wasn't. And Jimmy Fitzmaurice had 43% of the vote in the field. I was next with 12, and I think Billy Gust had 10, John Petrie had 9 or 7 or 8, and the rest were down below that mark. But Jimmy Fitzmaurice had an overwhelming advantage on the early polls, and that was even up until September of election year. That poll was taken in the springtime. We began to campaign in the summer. I had put up campaign signs, other people were putting it up, and we took another poll in September, and the numbers had not changed, given to a point or two, which was pretty frustrating because you think you're working hard. 3 months have passed, you set up a headquarters, and there's now talk about the election, and nothing has really moved. And there was some thought of, frankly, of not even running, because the odds looked too severe. I had no major organizational support. The CCDA, which was not what it was in the early days, but still a fairly powerful organization, was a little split, mostly with Jimmy Fitzmaurice, and the RDO hardly didn't exist with any great degree of strength. But they still had parochial offices. Those groups back in the 40s and 50s were very, very, very powerful groups. And you had no really activist black groups, except groups that would be considered to be auxiliary,
Right.
like the CCIVL, the OPPVL, which was Reverend Davis's group. Now, they were powerful and they were good, but they were auxiliary to the CCDA. CCDA set the agenda, the policy, the candidates. They just helped.
The new groups that showed up on the scene in the election.
Pardon?
You did have support of new groups that showed up.
Right. There were
in the
small
form of-
groups at
in the
that
form
time
of black
that
leadership.
that had no really name recognition. Cole, Soul, Cool, and Bold. And all of us struggled for whatever leadership, whatever support you could get. I'm simply saying they were not the premier groups. The CCIVL, the Black Longshoremen, Reverend Davis's group, and I didn't have any of those older line groups. But I did manage to get the Cool group and the Soul group. Now, they were very, very helpful to me, but they were not the group that they became after I became mayor. And of course, the difference in political groups was patronage. Did they have any jobs at City Hall? Did they have any jobs in the assessor's office? Did they have any jobs in the sheriff's offices? The answer is clearly no. So there wasn't much of a organized base. Now, they were young and bright and very active, and to that extent, very, very effective, and I was tickled to death to have them. So
Did that help? Now, to get into the runoff, to what extent was the black vote important in getting into the runoff?
well, it was very important, but the black vote was very split. Between John Petrie, who had a good base in the 7th Ward, was seen as a friend of the black community. I'm not talking about an integrationist, I'm talking about a friend of the black community. As Morrison was seen as a friend of the black community. Billy Gus, because of his reputation as a senator and because of his father and his family, was seen as a friend of the black community. And Dave Gertler, being Jewish and had some sway because of Jewish activism in pushing for civil rights, had a certain amount of sympathy in the black community. I was the only one, insofar as I can recall, that had a record of support, both through the legislature and when I was on the city council. But that didn't sway everybody. There was no claim that I had that look what I've done.
Mm-hmm. But it was recognized to some.
But obviously it was recognized, and I got a decent portion of that split black vote. Jimmy Fitzmaurice got some black votes. He was not running as a Southern segregationist by any stretch. Jimmy's never been that. Right. But I got enough votes to get in, and in the meantime, Jimmy's numbers, when the election totals came in, fell from 43 down to 36. And mine and Billy Gus's went up, as I recall, to 18. Billy had 16, I think, 17. So a pretty close election. So that put me in some reasonable position in the second primary. Now the gap had narrowed from, well, 43 to 12 is now 36 to 18. It's still a pretty good gap. And then we enter into the second primary. And then race became more of a factor in the second primary. There's no question about it.
How did it show up as a more of a factor? I think.
Well, first of all, most of the African Americans who were supporting Billy Gus, who was supporting John Petrie, Dave Gertler, began to shift to me. And I think that was just a natural shift. Mm-hmm. I think they saw, Jimmy Fitzmaurice as yesterday. I think they saw me as tomorrow. There's no self-praise. I was just younger. Jimmy had been around for a long time. And that began to shift. And then one of the very important factors that took place was in the second primary, Dutch Moriel ended up in the second primary for a councilmanic seat at large, and so did Joe DeRosa. And I endorsed Dutch Moriel. Endorsements meant a great deal then. I mean, you ran on tickets. We don't run on tickets any longer, but you ran on tickets, and the mayor headed the ticket, and everybody else you were supporting was on that ticket, and they supported the top.
And Dutch Moriel would have been the first black councilman.
He would have been the first black councilman, and I supported him. I think the election might have been different if Jimmy had endorsed Dutch Moriel, but he didn't. Because of the political backing he had, who were for DeRosa, he took DeRosa as a candidate on his ticket. And Dutch was required to support me, being on my ticket. So I had Dutch Moriel on the ticket, first black councilman, and I think that resonated significantly among the black vote. Then we had the debates, and in one of the major debates, the question was put to the two of us, will you hire a black department head? And Jimmy Fitzmaurice answered the question first, and he said, I will hire the most qualified person, which was a clear signal to blacks that blacks need not apply. When you say that, it's in the language. It's not an intention. It's in the language, as I'm saying. I don't think Jimmy meant that. I'm telling you how I think it resonated. I said something like, the question isn't, well, yes, I will, but that's not the question. The question is, how do we achieve bring blacks into the community? And I don't think we were even using the term black at that time. How do we bring them into the government and to make it function better and to make the city function better? In any event, that was maybe 2 weeks before the election. And I think that also had an impact on the racial vote. Now, to say that these were unnuanced grabs for the black vote is not so. It's how you answer the question, it's language. And so the black vote began to consolidate behind me. It had already started to consolidate, but I think that pushed the consolidation even further, and by election day, I won pretty handily. think it was 54 to 46 or 53-7 to 36 something.
And your percentage of the black vote was,
About 95%.
as you said.
That's what my recollection. I can't give you a precise figure.
But then we had a runoff election this time, which in previous years, the runoff election where the Democratic nominee faces the Republican nominee didn't really matter for
Well,
anything.
I didn't think we had an election coming up. Ben Toledano, who is I don't want to say a deep friend, but let me say a friend, a colleague, I knew from grade school really, had qualified. He was a conservative states writer who was now a Republican, and said that he had run in case Dave Gertler had gotten thing, because he had this thing against Dave Gertler. I'm just told that. I don't know the truth of that. But I had passed that Public Accommodations Act right before the let me try to think to get my stuff straight.
We'll accept that it was not long before the election and had effect.
Right. I have it. We had run the Democratic primary in November, and I was still on the city council, but for all practical purposes, having the Democratic nomination, the mayor-elect, not technically, but so to speak. And I put the public accommodations ordinance forward under my name. I think Henry Curtis, who was, strangely enough, a very conservative, he was an old Southerner, but not a racist, but typical of all of us grew up as racists. He would have not been the person you would have thought would put his name on the ordinance, but he had committed to do it because they'd come to us right before the election and asked us to do it.
Who was they?
It was Human Relations Commission. That had been a convention came into town that was mistreated someplace in a public place.
You mean it's black participants?
Yes, and the group came to City Hall and I said, listen, I'm totally sympathetic with you, but we can't do that in the teeth of an election. It doesn't make any sense. But if you wait till the election is over, the council will still be sitting, and I promise you it'll get done. Well, the election was over, and I went to the council, and some of them said, boy, you think we're crazy? We're not doing that. I said, look, we made this commitment. And of course, you know, I'm full of, can a man who tells the truth win, and always do what I say, et cetera, et cetera.
And you're in the runoff.
No.
I mean, you're in the general election.
Yes.
With Toledano.
Yes. But I didn't think there would be much of an election. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sure Toledano would even run. He was still on the ballot, so to speak, or still qualified. But we passed it with no great hassle.
Tell me what the public accommodations law said in just a general quick summary.
The federal government had passed a federal law saying, for instance, that you can't discriminate if you're operating a hotel above so many people. I don't know the parameters, and I'm going way back and dealing off of a poor memory. There were limitations. I remember the housing bill, which was a non-discriminatory bill, I think had a limitation, whether it was the number of units, whether, for instance, if the hotel had 2 people, I don't know whether a 10-room, that might have been exempt. I'm not sure. But there were many holes in the federal law that they had to do in order to get adopted. That was 5 years. Mm-hmm. That was 1965, as I recall. So we're talking about 1970 now. So 5 years had passed, but there were a number of holes in that law. I know it didn't apply to barbershops, for instance. I don't think it applied to bar rooms. I don't know how they were exempt in the federal statute, but that's my recollection.
So the
So
New
we
Orleans law-
broadened significantly the federal statute to apply to the city of New Orleans. Which, when you think about it, we're a deep southern city. I mean, this is a national law that had great drama in getting passed, but we're a deep southern city. Times are changing. It's 5 years later, that's true. But there was still serious opposition to social integration. There's no question about that.
Your law applied to neighborhood bars.
As far as I can recall, it did.
Yeah.
And Ben Toledano, assisted by Irvin Magri, who was then the head of the police union, who objected to me for many other reasons, straightening out the police pension fund and a multitude of other things, raising a black to be deputy, and he pretty well organized the opposition to me. And they, it did make a huge difference, but they went to every bar room, every beauty parlor, every place they could go, you know, the natives are coming, the natives are coming,
So that created some vigor in the
Well, yes, it
in the
did.
Republican campaign.
Well,
it didn't have before the public economy.
I don't want to blame the Republicans, because he ran as a Republican, but the Republicans were not necessarily pushing that at the time. I mean, you had the fairly liberal Republicans around, but we were in that mood where the world was changing from the Rockefeller Republicans into a more conservative Republican base. And yes, I would say that it was part Republican, but it hadn't really gotten there yet. It was just as much as states' rights as anything else.
So it was a local conservative.
Correct. And there are many, many, many Republicans, local Republicans here who didn't agree with that at all. So we ended up not having to open a headquarters but we ended up having to at least have a campaign. I mean, you owe that to the public. You can't sit there if you are going to serve and act as if you were coronated. So we did have a campaign, but nowhere near the primary campaign for the Democratic nomination, and we won pretty significantly. I mean, I don't forget the numbers, whether it was 70-30, 60-40.
Would you say that race was a issue in this general election?
Oh, absolutely.
And how did the sides line up on that? I mean,
What sides you talking
was it
about?
strictly over your supporters and Mr. Toledano's supporters?
Well,
Was it
first
strictly
of
over?
all, there was no great campaign. I don't think we had any debates. I don't recall any debates. We could have. No, I don't think we had any debates. And we didn't have a headquarters. We ran some TV advertising, some newspaper advertising, so there was not a big street push. And I'm not saying we knew we were going to win. Just the question is, did you want to make at least a demonstration that you weren't taking it as fait accompli, that votes still had to be counted? So I can't answer that question.
And did that campaign have any relation, any impact on subsequent racial attitudes in New Orleans? The general runoff campaign?
Look, every
I
election
mean, the
where
general
you
election
have a
campaign?
candidate pushing a racial button, it solidifies people. Maybe there's still hope, you understand? Maybe the segregation can one day come back. Maybe Jim Crow is not dead, and bear in mind, the argument by this time is not, let's close the public schools. That was 1960. This is 10 years later. Right. And the argument was not, let's close the hotels, or let's not have any integrated football games anymore. I mean, society passes those points. But those in the resistance movement still resisted, because there were new thresholds to cross that they know were coming. So what about going into
Go ahead.
into restaurants now? I know the restaurants were covered by federal law, but are the New Orleans Police Department going into these restaurants to make sure that people are being served? Well, you can say, well, the federal U.S. Attorney Marshals are, but they're very limited in number. You make it a city ordinance, and all of a sudden you have rather immediate oversight and enforcement. So people, as long as Washington was up here, yeah, they lost that battle, but we're still down here and we're living our life. As I've said before, there is a thought in all of us that something happened. The civil rights movement started when Martin Luther King gave this wonderful speech. No, it was magnificent, and it's one of the high moments. But the civil rights movement started, I think, when the first black slave wanted the freedom. I mean, it builds from there. The Freedom Trail, the Second World War, the movement to get the blacks to vote in 1870 something. So you don't start at a point. There are memorable points. There are significant points. There are high emotional points. So integration took that kind of thing. Now, the school integration, Brown versus Board, 1954. We're still, to this day, arguing. There is now a federal lawsuit against vouchers because it's interfering with the integration implemented because of the 1954 decision. So these things do not appear and die instantly. They don't grow instantly, and they don't die instantly. They, as General MacArthur said, they just fade away. So it had an impact, yes, in the sense that I think in every election, whether you're running for president or governor, you take a poll a week before the election, and the poll is going to show, now it was more lopsided with Toledano because of the Democrat-Republican thing, but in most elections, you're looking at 53, 47, 51, 49. After the person gets elected, you take a poll, and the president's popularity is at 65%. So the people who didn't vote are not necessarily against that person serving in office. They're not carrying they're not angry over their vote not having won. You're the president, fine, we got a great democracy, and I'm all for you. And of course, the president proceeds to gain or lose on those numbers. He can drive them up or he can drive them down, depending upon his performance in office. So, yeah, it had an impact, but I would think that 70% of the people wish me well once I got elected. I don't sense there was any 49% of the people adhering to the old thoughts, but
Did having to run the general election did that make it harder to be mayor or easier?
Well, let me say this too much before you answer that question. There was another factor that enters in this. Jimmy Fitzmaurice had a very loyal base of followers. And I suspect that many of them, this being the second mayoralty that he lost, I felt badly for Jimmy, and I had won. I called him on the night of election. I called Jimmy Fitzmaurice, not the losing candidate calling the victor. I called Jimmy and expressed my regret that he wasn't going to be mayor. I was obviously happy that I'd won, but I had then, do now, have enormous respect for Jimmy Fitzmaurice. There was a backlash among many conservative whites, separate and apart from the racial issue. That's that Jimmy lost. And I, being one of Jimmy's proteges, had beaten him.
And the backlash
And it
was against you.
Yes. And voted for Toledano in that election. What I'm simply trying to say is it wasn't just racists that voted for Ben Toledano. There were conservatives who really loved Jimmy Fitzmaurice, felt very disappointed that he hadn't won. So that's a natural backlash.
And did Mr. Toledano himself do anything or say anything that would be gave encouragement to those racial voters?
Well, he certainly ran on it. Now I can't speak to remember any particular speeches that he gave, but he was very outspoken conservative. I don't know what else he would have run on. He had no real political base, no record of office holding. I don't mean he wasn't a qualified candidate. I knew Ben and liked him. I mean, to the extent I disagreed with him strongly, but because of his advocacy of states' rights, which he and David Treen, whom I also got to be great friends with. I developed great admiration for Dave Treen later in life. But they were both out there on that very conservative side, less racial than it was just conservative Republican politics. Ben, I think, sees this racial thing, and I don't believe Ben was ever a Kluxer. I don't think so.
So now you've gotten elected mayor, and you've got to do something about that workforce in City Hall. You have how did you get in aftermath during the time that you were running City Hall? People were willing to say that this was a collection of very capable, bright people. Some people even used the word Camelot. So you got bright people from all walks of life, all kinds of backgrounds. How did you get capable staff in responsible positions from the black community?
It's a very interesting topic. What I didn't realize, and what the vast majority of people didn't realize, whites and blacks, is that we didn't really know one another. I grew up, as I said, living within a distance of 300 feet, as far as I could throw a baseball, from my nearest black neighbor, and lived my entire life that way. But I had no black friends. Norman Francis is the first black friend I ever had, and that I'm now 22 years old. When I say a friend, I'm talking about somebody I knew by first name, somebody I felt on an equal plane with. I had seen people, I might have known a kid in the neighborhood by a first name or nickname or something, but there was never any friendship there. Just the way I grew up, the way New Orleans was. Not mean, but certainly not open, not fair, not just, but they were there, we're here. That's the way society was. I don't think a black had ever been in our home, in fact, as I know, on a social basis until the crawfish party I had for the
That you mentioned.
after
At Loyola.
at law school, and by the same token, we'd never been in a black home. Now blacks knew more about whites, which whites never quite understood. I think not. I don't say understood. They never knew, never thought about it. But blacks were caretakers. They were domestic servants. They worked in the yard. They did repair work in the houses, but they worked within the white environment. Whites never worked within the black environment. So I think it's fair to say that the black society knew more about white society than the white society knew about black society. Whites did not realize, and I discovered this, a lot of this was just fascinating to me, that how whites assumed or didn't think that blacks could hear. So that when the blacks are in the kitchen and the whites are talking at the table, they are hearing. I'm not saying they're eavesdropping, they're hearing. When there's a black working at the NOAC in the men's room, picking up towels, doing whatever, cleaning up, janitor, when he's at the lawn tennis club, when he's at the country club, in the locker room, they're hearing. And they hear comments. I've had one person tell me that they were and I'd love to use his name, but I don't want to take liberty of telling his stories. But he was in the club, and he heard the conversation on more than one occasion between people who were upscale Orleanians, and then in the short time of 5 or 6 years, he's a lawyer, and he's sitting across the table negotiating from these people on a racial issue. And he's looking at the same person. Now, he knows what they said in the locker room. Now we're talking, in as equals across the table. You can imagine the advantage that he had, having explored that.
Did they know that he was the same person?
Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not. These things happened. It was not just, that's not just an occurrence. That was the way life was. Mm-hmm. So many whites felt that listen, blacks are happy. Just don't disturb them. They're very happy with what they have, et cetera, et cetera. Because many blacks said that to their white employers. They didn't want to show dissatisfaction for fear of getting fired. But when Jackie Robinson made the major leagues, there was rampant joy in America about Jackie Robinson making the major leagues. Now, I was an 18-year-old, and to show you the difference, I thought that Jackie Robinson made the major leagues because now, for the first time, they found a black who's qualified to be a major leaguer. And I was happy about that. I was a baseball player. Gee, that's terrific, They finally found a black. Because I'd been raised in a segregated street, a segregated society. And the feeling was that blacks aren't capable of playing major leagues. Now, they play in the Black Pelicans, and they play in this league and that little Mickey Mouse league. Why would I think differently? You pick up the Times-Picayune or the States Item or Sports Illustrated or whatever existed at the time, and what did you see? White ball players hitting giant home runs, whites doing this, whites catching passes. Where did you see blacks? Nowhere, unless you got an Ebony magazine. I don't know if Ebony existed. They played in small, terrible, not terrible, but small, tiny stadiums. They didn't play big time. I'm an 18-year-old, never done much except play ball and try to get a date here and there. And I'm thinking, well, this is, the major leagues are playing in the North. I mean, that's the Yankees. This is Brooklyn. This is, Detroit. They don't discriminate up north. With the South, we discriminate against blacks. They don't discriminate up north. Stupid, I fully confess. But I know what my thinking was. And, but Verna often talks about her domestic maid, and she is crazy about, would be in the kitchen listening to the ball game when Robinson was playing. I mean, it was a big thing. So every little step made a difference. But the major point that I'm making is that blacks knew a great deal more about white society than whites knew about black society. However, having said that, blacks didn't know enough about white society. Clearly, whites didn't know enough about black society. But even with the advantage blacks had of working in white households and white businesses, they still didn't know anything about the government of any consequence.
So
Not
this
because
was
because they weren't educated. It was the lack of practical experience. I mean, we have deans and professors at SUNO and at Xavier and Dillard, but they weren't on the inside of the political process.
Well, by the time you were finished, you had a lot of very highly capable
Well, I was very grateful.
black
Listen,
employees in City Hall and leadership positions. How did you find them?
Jack, the point
did
that
you break
I
in?
understand
Yeah.
where you're
Yeah.
going, but I've got to tell you first,
Uh-huh.
the point is that I needed to find them, and I didn't have any personal acquaintances. Oh, I knew more than most whites, but because I now had been in this, dealing with black organizations, black people, black supporters, black ministers for these years, but I still didn't, let's put it this way, when you're white, you go to a bar mitzvah. It's all your family, intimate friends, they're all white. You go to a Catholic confirmation, it's all white. You go to a wedding, it's all white. It's not because people are even thinking discrimination, it's just family. That's who you are. You invited your family. So you don't have this spread of meeting people on an equal stage. What we did in order to try to foster that, and Verna played an invaluable role in this, and I'll get back to the employment in a minute, was to broaden this thing into society generally, so that every party we had, every party we were invited to, if it was a close friend, we would ask them, please invite a black. And if they didn't know anybody, we'd give them the name. Now, the reason people wouldn't invite a black was, first of all, there was this normal veil up there between black and white. But another big reason is they didn't know anybody socially attuned that they could invite. So we would give them names that we knew of close friends of ours that would fit in at those parties, or at this function, at that function. We had 4 functions at Gallia Hall that we had every year. And Verna had asked Sybil Morial to work with her and several other women, black and white, to develop a mixed invitation list. And one of the funny things we discovered is that many blacks wouldn't come because they felt uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It isn't as if, oh, wow, you just open the door and blacks want to rush in to join this, though. It was contrary to their social mores, too. Later on, that broke down, obviously, but it took time to break down that resistance, reluctance. You know, why would a prominent black businessman, other than for economic purposes, want to take and go sit and watch a white ball, which is so contrary to the way their customs worked? Why would a white person want to go where we're doing things big, bing, bing, bing on 2 beats and they're doing it on 4 beats? It's a different culture. So the point is, we were trying to bring, not trying to be Superman, but try to bring the cultures together, to have people mix, not only politically, which we were able to do as mayor. I was able to do that. But socially and economically. What about in business partners, so that we began to feel comfortable with one another? We're getting there. We're not fully there, but we're getting there, and this is now 40 years later. But in any event, back to your question, the division in society meant that I wanted to hire bright people who could do the job, and I didn't know any. I mean, I had asked Norman, I asked other people, or formative people, but, you know, people in their jobs, and we only had one black architect in town. That was Skip Perkins, and one black accountant, one black CPA. We had a handful of lawyers, quite a few doctors, but, you know, there were not many black professionals. And so when you start thinking about who will come to City Hall and work to start with, it's not that we're paying gigantic salaries. Those people were pretty successful at times in their life, so they're not ready to just give up their time. So I went to Coup and to Bold and Sold and said, send me people. And they obviously wanted to. Now, bear in mind, we had broken down the old political structure. I did not want the ward leader, precinct captain, block leader system. And I broke that down. I don't mean I did it personally, but essentially because I did away with that kind of patronage system where if you want a job, you go see the ward leader and you can get a job no matter what your qualifications are. Not knocking that. That's the way it existed back in the 30s and the 40s, and was dying when I got in office. But I still understood the politics of having organizational support, but this was not a structured with me as the head of the organization.
Well, were Coup and Bold and Soul able to give you
Yes, they
the
were.
people to get started?
Yes, they did, and it was not easy because they often sent me people that I did not accept. And there's one wonderful story.
Except for what reason?
Because I didn't think they were qualified. Now, they were not terribly interested. I don't mean that they weren't interested in qualified people. This guy is a friend, and he worked in the campaign, and he wants the job. They were not jobless people. These are not homeless people that you're talking about. All of these people, 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds, 25-year-olds, have jobs. Now, the question is whether they want to leave those jobs and come to City Hall. Some did, some doesn't. Norman Francis, of course, wouldn't. Clarence Jupiter wouldn't. I offered them high positions at City Hall. So dealing with the people that I knew, I was not being very successful in getting people to leave their job to come work in this environment. And one of the great stories, and I won't tell too many of these, but this one's worth telling, was one of the leaders of Soul came to me, and he had his bad face on, and he said, "Bawana," he called me Bawana, which is Tarzan, and they always refer to Tarzan. He says, "You know, your problem is you want super ants." And I said, "Well, you're right. It doesn't do us a damn bit of good to replace an incompetent white with an incompetent black, and I'm not going to do it. So find me somebody who can do the job." So they came to me with Pete Sanchez, who was been a major in the United States Army and was out now, and so I was going to hire Pete. But before I did, and before I offered him the job, I went to Pete Gagliano, who was, I'd known Pete. We'd worked together in many campaigns, but he'd supported Fitzmaurice, and under the rules of the game, he was out. Okay, he knew that. Everybody would be given their walking papers. So Pete came in to see me. He was a swarthy, wonderful guy, swarthy Italian, considerably older than I was, really short guy, and an interesting person. I'd really liked Pete. And he thought I was going to fire him. And I said, "Pete, would you like to stay on?" "Oh, man, God, I love it, I love it, I love it, you know." So I said, "Pete, but I need a favor. I'm going to appoint a black to head your department." I said, "You know where everybody is buried in that department. And I want this man to succeed. And I'm afraid when I appoint him as the first black department head, the whites are going to cut his legs off. They're just going to do everything they can to slow it down, not make it work, make him look bad, and I need your assurance that you'll stay by his side as long as he wants you. The day he decides he doesn't need you any further, I will find another place for you." So I called Pete Sanchez and offered him the job and said, "Pete, I'll put you in this department, Department of Property Management." I did not want to do one of the normal things like welfare or something that you'd say was a normal black. If you're going to do it, you do it in that context. Property management is a very, very important department with a lot of authority over all the buildings in the city and workforces and contracts. So I said, I told him the same story. I said, "Now Pete Gagliano is there. He's there to be by your side and to guide you. No reflection on you. I'm just telling you. If I were you, I would stay close to Pete. The day you think you don't need Pete any longer, you just tell me and I'll find a new place for Pete. But I'll leave that up to you. My advice to you is hug him." And from that day forward, for the next 8 years, nobody ever saw Pete Gagliano and Pete separate in City Hall. They were called Pete and Repeat. Maybe we paid two people for one job, but that was okay. The point is that you had to find a way to do these things. You couldn't just muscle it. Yes, you have authority, but use it discreetly. Be smart.
And Pete Sanchez was a success.
Yes, he was. Everybody liked Pete. He did a good job, did a great job. We thereafter put in other department heads. Terrence DeVerney became the chief administrative officer 6 years into the administration. Bob Tucker was mayor's assistant and invaluable. And we had Hank Braden, who's now deceased. I could go through all your names. Emmett Moten, Jim Singleton came in to work on health initiatives out of Bold, which was just then forming, which was an uptown organization. Now these organizations had, one was in the 7th Ward, one was kind of 9th Ward, Louisiana and Gentilly, and the Bold organization was uptown in the 10th, 11th, 1 and 2 wards. So they're not the only organizations, but they were the dominant young blacks. And Cool was really based out of St. Augustine. Sidney Bartholomew came one of the early appointees. He just graduated from Tulane, and he worked in the mayor's office.
These names you just mentioned were given to you through the vehicle of the political organization.
Yes, and through other friends, but mainly through the political groups. But they were not as if they came out of a precinct captain, is what I'm saying to you. That was just a kind of given. If you want a job, you get it. It was a recommending process. Charlie Elwha had come, and Charlie later became a district court judge. And where I didn't have department heads, I had deputies, and then there were women. I appointed a black receptionist so that people would know that the world had changed.
In the mayor's office.
Yes. But it was a daily. It really took a daily effort to move things, and then during the course of things, we had to make a rule and I made the rule that we were getting complaints because we had white supervising blacks and black supervising whites. We would have these racial complaints that, well, I'm being disciplined because of race, because I'm white and he's a black, vice versa. So I met with Terrence, who was almost like a son to me, and we agreed that no one could discipline a person of another race without first going to him. That was another way to ease this thing. Okay, you have a complaint against the fella in your department. I'm not talking about somebody that shoots a cop or a cop shoots somebody. That's different. I'm talking about office discipline. Then go see the chief administrator officer, set your case out, and if he says, fine, I agree with the discipline, we do it on both sides of the equation. And that worked quite effectively. Now, there wasn't much of that because the blacks and whites got along. These are younger people. We're hiring young blacks and young whites, and this was the 1970s. I mean, race is something, segregation is something. A lot of these kids were out there marching for integration. So, you had people like Mary Zerbagon and who else I'm thinking of? You got to forgive me because my names keep slipping on me, but
well, you had a lot of good names. You had
a lot of names of people, and Tony Gagliano and
related to Pete?
Huh? Yes, a nephew of Pete's, and but they got along very well. I mean, it was it's why they called it Camelot. I don't know whether we deserve that or not, but they got along extremely well, and they didn't know work hours. If you stood in front of the elevators at 4:30, the civil service people were all leaving in droves. These kids were staying up there till 9 and 10 at night. Work was their life. They're fascinated by it. Larry Coleman was 22 years old. You had, some of the other names will come to me. Dan McClung, both of them are white. Henry Moulton.
Emmett?
Excuse me, not Henry. Emmett Moulton, yeah.
How did you tell that this, when were you able to tell that this was working?
There's something before I've got to interrupt your thing.
Okay.
And then part of the problem, of course, was civil service. Because I only had the power, the mayor only has the power to appoint 3 people in each department. So you got 13 departments. and you've got 3 people. That's the department head, the deputy, and the secretary. 3. So that's 3 times 13. It's 39, am I right? People that I have the power to appoint. Then, outside of the operational aspects of the government, there's the mayor's office. And I had a limited number of people there, like I had 3 executive assistants and a couple of secretaries and this. I don't know the numbers. But that is fixed. The city council would fix the numbers that I could have. But Lyndon Johnson passed this legislation that, and we were very much beneficiaries of the civil rights movement and the Model Cities program and revenue sharing and special revenue sharing and summer programs. So we now have this federal money coming in that permits us, separate and apart from the city budget, to hire people to run these programs. And I did not have to go through civil service. Now eventually civil service came to me and said, we gotta come to an understanding, because you can't just keep hiring these people outside of the merit system. And I said, well, I understand that, but if I go through the merit system, I'm never going to get the people from these neighborhoods that I need to run these neighborhood programs. So we agreed that I could go ahead and hire, and then they would be then put into the civil service protective system. So that was a combination of my appointive power as mayor within the mayor's office. But that's where I could hire them, was within the mayor's office. I couldn't hire them within the city structured departments. And then they would be placed in various departments. So it took a lot of massaging to trying to just keep moving this thing forward.
So the federal programs are really a...
Federal programs were enormously helpful to us. And I'm told that when we started, there were 10% blacks working in City Hall, and 8 years later, it was 40%, I think.
Many of them in the federal funded programs?
No, and all over City Hall. Yeah, listen, you had things like, I know it sounds funny today, but you just got to put yourself back. We had no black plumbers. Did I cover this before? We had no black plumbers. Nobody came to me. I just said, why don't we have a black plumber one day? Why aren't there any black plumbers?
In the city administration?
Yeah, not in the administration, in the city.
In the city.
There are no black plumbers. You're talking about economic development. Where would you have economic development? Why not? Places like being plumbers, carpenters, contractors. Well, nobody's passed the test. And if those that did pass the test, we don't know if any did, you got to be an apprentice for a year or 2 years under a white master plumber before you can become a plumber on your own. So I said, well, okay. How about getting me a black plumber, or somebody who wants to be a black plumber? Find somebody for me, and I'll find a master plumber and have him take him under his wing. So the person did. They found somebody, went to Delgado. Then we got a white plumber to take him on as a whatever the term is, and then he became a master plumber on himself. But think about that. I mean, that's an arduous process. Okay, so we did one, right? Now I'm hoping that black plumber was conscious enough to want to educate other black plumbers to become full plumbers. But I also am knowledge enough of human nature to know that when somebody's aboard, they will also say, pull up the ladder. I got a lock on the business. Why should I have any competition? So you get caught in this business of personal interest. and some of the political groups, they were all good guys. It's no personal criticism. But they had personal interest in their group. They weren't particularly interested, so wasn't particularly interested in somebody from Coup getting a position. Bode interested in somebody from Seoul getting in a position. And I remember one election in which there was a vacancy and a white had held it. In fact, it was Dutch Moriel's seat in the legislature, and he left to become a juvenile judge. And I went to the group in that territory, which was sold, and said, who's our candidate? And they said, well, we don't have a candidate. We don't have anybody. I said, man, I don't pass elections. Get me a candidate. And we did come up with candidate Dorothy Taylor. And this might be hard, and maybe it's not entirely fair, but my impression was that they would just as soon pass the election and let it go back white than to give it to a competing black group. Is that a fair guess? Is that fair? I don't know. But the thought you'd pass an election in your territory and not want to, rather than take a candidate from another group, because the competition, and I can tell you, under the RDO and CCDA, it was that way. I mean, it was Republican Democrats in the strongest terms, although not officially Democrat-Republican, they're both Democrat. But organizational structure integrity was important. So I don't know why blacks were any different than whites. Whites have been guilty of it consistently, of looking at the personal interest more than the broad view of society.
So is this sort of a sign of success that you've got? Are you seeing the newly active, newly employed black political leaders, black government officials, they're starting to act like the old organizations?
Oh, of course, no, the organizations died a long time ago. I mean, Coup, Soul, and Bowl, they're gone because...
But they've successfully, in large measure, they've successfully participated in
Well, they successfully participated, put people in public office, but like the RDO and CCDA, they died too. I'm not saying they're not there in name, but they're not existing insofar as active political organization. Who were 25 and 30-year-olds are now 60 and 70-year-olds. I mean, they passed it, and there was no growth underneath. First of all, the political patronage system is not dead by any stretch, but it's certainly nowhere near what it was before civil service, and even after civil service froze in everybody. And there's a far greater independence of public officials. Today, the ward structure is broken down. There's no such thing now as each having 7 assessors, for instance, in different sections, or having the clerk of court, civil district court, come out of the 2nd ward, and the sheriff come out of the 7th ward. The recorder of mortgages, the 8th ward, and the recorder of conveyances out of 9th ward. And that was true of all the parochial officers. This was a set pattern. That was just what tradition held, and you could roughly, when you belong to the organization, that's our job, that's our job.
And so this is now, at this point, this was gone.
It's gone, yeah.
So
it was
when did you realize that you were having success at integrating city government's workforce? When did you think it was taking hold? Was there any sign that things were getting better?
No. Within City Hall, we had a great success. I'm not telling we had arrived at utopia, but we had success. And I think with the appointment of Terrence DeVerney, who just was terrific. Terry had no detractors.
Yeah, as chief administrative officer.
So, and of course, after I left, we've subsequently had a black chief of police. We were short on black firemen. I went to the civil service and the people said, why don't we have more black firemen? We think blacks don't like fires or afraid of fires. I said, you gotta be kidding me. He said, well, man, we don't get many applications. Well, where do you advertise? Like everything else, we advertise in the Times-Picayune, you know, State's Item or whatever it was. I said, how about advertising in the weekly? How about going to the high schools and make known that we have vacancies? Okay. What I'm simply saying is it wasn't an effort not to. There was a lack of positive push to do it. Nobody saw, I don't say nobody saw the need, but it wasn't anybody's job to see that it got done. It was my job.
It was the mayor's job.
My job, yes.
Could you delegate that to anybody in your office?
Well, sure you could, but it's like anything else in life. You have eyes and ears, and I have the best seat in the house, and I can see. I don't see everything, and I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I have a good seat. So I'd ride around the city and every Saturday by myself, just looking at things. Why is this like this? Why is this not different? Why is that? It's a 24-hour-a-day job with the mayor, if you really want to be a good mayor. With many employees, it's a 9-to-5 job. You know, that's what it is. And you do what's before you on your desk. You move it from here to here to here.
Well, as you were looking around the city, you also saw boards and commissions that were up till now.
Right. In addition to
all
the
white.
social work that we did of trying to involve social parties, and there's one another story I want to tell you all before I get off this subject, because it's not about me. This is about society. It's true that the mayor is the visual head of the city, but you've also got civil service. And I had really done, I think, with Norman Francis serving on that board, made a huge difference in the employment from the day he got on. If I could take credit for hiring 20, Norman could take credit for having been the father of 200 by virtue of making the civil service understand and adhere to certain fair rules. But you have the commissions, boards, commissions. You got the Surgeon Water Board. You've got I appointed somebody there, Ben Johnson. I appointed the Surgeon Water Board. All of these sound like tokens, but you got to start from zero. There's got to be a first. Then the Parkway Commission and the Audubon Park Board and the Aviation Board, and so all of the boards and commissions. What I'm simply saying to you is that I needed names, people, and as I grew in the administration, then I had better contacts, better names, better references. But initially it was difficult, and then many people don't know or don't realize that it's a sacrifice to serve on these boards and commissions. You're a person working for a living. You chewing up a couple of days of your time a month. It takes time. It's a contribution, and there's no pay attached to it. But there is authority.
Were any of those boards and commissions difficult to deal with from your perspective?
No.
I mean,
no.
You could tell them who to take. You could appoint the.
Well, I had the appointive power.
Yeah.
The mayor has the appointive power. It's that you don't have, the board doesn't transfer. If you got 12 people on the board, they all don't go out of office at one time. They're overlapping terms. Mm-hmm. So you got to wait for a vacancy to occur, and then you can fill that vacancy. Well, there were people on the boards who left because that was early on, not anywhere into the administration in any depth. But in the early years, there were people who would just resign from the board because they didn't want to serve with the black.
Which gave you more opportunities.
Well, they created another position on that board, but that's not what it was about. They just,
So that went smoothly, the city boards and commissions?
well, I think it all went smoothly. I mean, but you're gonna have people in City Hall who didn't wanna work under black. I mean, that's understandable. There were whites who don't wanna work under black. I'm sure there are blacks who didn't wanna work under white.
Let me ask you about the private organizations. As we were finishing our last session, you mentioned the Plimsoll Club and the Sugar Bowl. Are those cases that deserve some require some effort on your part?
Well, there's no question about it. There are those things
Now, these are private organizations, and
I don't want to get into this being about me.
Yeah.
There are things that the mayor can do
right.
on his own because he has the authority constitutionally, city charter-wise. He has the power and the authority. I can appoint the police chief. Now, theoretically, that's assuming that. Well, yes, I can. There will, as I recall the city charter as it then existed, the Department of Law and the Department of Police were under the mayor. The other departments were under the chief administrative officer. So technically, if I wanted to make a departmental appointment, I had to go through the chief administrative officer. Now, the problem with that system is that I appoint the chief administrative officer and I could fire him on the spot if he doesn't take the guy I want. But I tried to give some latitude to the person who had the authority for these jobs. Now, chief administrative officer wasn't going to appoint somebody that I didn't fully approve. And I worked so well with Ben Levy and Terrence DeVerney that we never had a cross word. Then there were the boards and commissions in which I could make appointments when there were vacancies, but that board still had the power to function as independently, so to speak, of the mayor. Not independently of the whole city hall or the process, but they had the authority to do what they wanted to do with their votes. I certainly had influence. Any mayor has influence with the boards and commissions. I went to the Audubon Park Board, told them, hey guys, either fix the zoo or tear it down. Just that simple. I don't want it anymore. The city doesn't need it. Either fix it or tear it down. And they came back to me with a proposal for a 2% property tax dedicated to the zoo. And that was the beginning of the restoration, the creation of the zoo and whatever else has flowed from it. And I give the members of that commission all the credit in the world for what they did with it. Would they have done it without my instruction? I'm sure sooner or later they would have, but it was something that was personal to me, and it was clear to me that that we couldn't maintain that zoo like it was. And I told them, go ahead and charge fees. Leave one day open for people who cannot, and children, or 1/2 day for kids that want to go and not have the money to pay for the admission charge, but put a charge on it. And then part of the reason was it was my childhood playground. And as a kid, we used to run through that zoo and create havoc as kids. And I was not the only child that did that. So, you know, these personal things hit you when you serve, and you can do it. But there were consequences from integration that people really do not quite get to. Let me just hold that thought for a minute, and I'm going to come back to it. You asked about outside organizations, and that's where I said I have the power, or the mayor has the power of this, but then you got limited power over boards and so forth. You have influence. What about the private organizations that are so important, that are part of the city's life? And I mean, the Plimsoll Club was just one. It just happens to be a poignant story. Joe Mayshaw, who was a very substantial black businessman, one of the biggest in town. He owned the funeral homes. Wanted to join the Plimsoll Club, and he put his application in and rejected him. He came to see me. I knew Joe well. Joe was educated, intelligent, attractive man. His wife was a very elegant lady.
And this was an all-white
Yes.
business club.
Yes, on top of the
They didn't have any black
international,
members at this
on the
point.
top of the International Trade Mart. And he said they rejected my application. I said, well, why? He said, well, I wasn't in international trade. Well, I knew a lot of people weren't in international trade. I mean, it was a legitimate international trade organization, but their base was much broader than that. So I called head of that group and said, listen, I understand that Mr. Michaud has made an application and he was turned down. And I knew why he was turned down. And he said, well, he's not in international trade. I said, but you have lots of people who are not in international trade. He's a prominent businessman, and I mean, I could fit him under the definition with a little argument. So I said, listen, please take a second look, will you? So I told Joe, and I called him up. I said, Joe, go reapply. So he reapplied, and then he called me back and said they rejected me again. So I said, okay. So I called back this manager and the president of the club. I said, listen, I've asked you politely to do this. There's no earthly reason other than race as to why you're turning this application down. I'm going to say to you that I'm going to declare that club off limits to any city employee. And I'm telling you, when I do that, and I don't want to do it, but no visiting ambassador is going to cross that threshold and go into that club when I declare it off limits for being a segregated club and against city policy. And without much to do, Joe was admitted to the club. Is that a historic moment? No, it's just the way things had to get done. Did others get in? I'm fairly sure it happened, and it happened also with other social organizations, where I didn't have the authority, but had to use at least some persuasion, even muscle, to say you got to do this for the following reasons. You're part of the city. It's important to the city. And if you don't, these are going to be the consequences. The YMBC was a young men's business club. And lots of city councilmen and others went to there and had lunch once a week. And it was pretty political. And I declared them off limits because they didn't take any blacks. And they simply died. They just died. I don't mean that I killed them. I'm simply saying they died. Because they weren't in step with the changing times, and there was resistance that people would they didn't want out, and that's their prerogative. But we don't have to go either.
Did anyone other than the members of these organizations or the leadership of these organizations knew that you had done these things?
Never called anybody.
I don't recall in the media there was any attention.
Never did it, and I would have been a fool to do so. When the new city club was being developed, I was out of office, and I made a call to Jim Singleton and said, Jim, don't let that happen. We don't need another segregated club.
Jim Singleton, in his capacity as a city councilman?
Yeah. I said, don't let that happen. Not that Jim, why did I think about it and Jim didn't? I don't know. It just thought occurred to me. I'm not bragging. It just the stuff was on my mind. One day I said, don't let that happen. So Jim got on it right away. He said, thanks for calling. Good idea. But you had to play where you could, you know. And
what about in carnival organizations? I mean, there was a moment when Well, there was a long period when Rex was not having black guests
Well,
or
Rex
members.
is different. I was not at all concerned about social. I was concerned about it, but nothing I cared to do anything about it, could do anything about the social nature of the political organizations that then existed. Except that when what's the big organization that not Rex, the truck big parade organization,
Tux? Oh, not Tux, the Orleanians.
the what?
The crew of Orleanians.
No, that's the
Yeah.
trucks. I said trucks, I didn't mean
Okay.
that. Big parade floats.
Endymion and Bacchus.
Bacchus.
Uh-huh.
And I was a city councilman when Bacchus sought a permit. And I told the two proposed captains who came to see me that I would not vote to approve another parade unless it had black members. To just not stop perpetuating this thing. I mean, they said, we promise you that while we can't do it the first year, we will do it immediately after we get formed and get started. Because the thought of them announcing that we're forming an integrated group worried them about getting it started at all. I took them at their word, approved the application, and Bacchus that did integrate. And virtually all of those groups are now integrated and getting along fine.
Did you have to pressure any?
Pardon?
Did you have to pressure
No.
any of them?
No, other than saying I'm not going to approve your permit. Not the other ones. The other ones got approved. Time passes by. A club would be a fool not to do it now. A club, really, if you wanted to do that and start a segregated group, go try it. Maybe it would work. I don't know. I don't think it fits the model of who we are today.
Did you have to go back to the ones that were traditionally segregated and get them to undo that?
No, I didn't. There were things that happened naturally. Reverend Davis became a councilman. Mayor Skiro had no children. He was married to a lovely lady. And during Mardi Gras, Mayor Skiro stood in the announcement box in front of Gallia Hall for every parade that passed Gallia Hall from the first fruit to the last. It's something he really loved. He just loved doing it. I concluded there was no way that I could do that. And I thought it was smart to divvy up the parades between the various councilmen so that parade that came out of basically a Ninth Ward parade, I'd ask Councilman Ciascio to handle that parade that night. I did not have to be there. All right, did not have to be there. Mayor Skiro made every ball, mostly 2 a night, during the entire season. I could not do that. I just physically didn't have that capacity. If the parade came out of the 7th Ward, okay, it would be Jimmy Morrow would announce it. If it came from uptown, it would be a accountant, it would be the councilman. Well, that meant that those crews, this did not apply now to Rex. It did not apply to the groups that had their own homes. Momus, Comas, Rex, might have been 1 or 2 others that had either home on St. Charles or Canal Street or stayed at a hotel where they received where the float stopped to toast their queen. So the Queen and the courts of every other crew came to City Hall. And so now what do we do with Reverend Davis? And there was a significant backlash from the captain of one crew who did not want the picture that was normally taken. Mascaro would go into the parlor and take a picture with the maids and the Queen. And I did that when I was on the stand. Now, A.L. Davis is on the stand. And they're gonna have their picture taken with Reverend A.L. Davis. Well, you would never mistake A.L. Davis for a white man. He was a wonderful friend of mine and a great minister and a terrific human being, and the first black councilman. But he was pretty dark. So when you think of these white maids and the white queen, now I'm not sure the girls minded, but the older captain of the group, who was in his 60s, and these queens of 15, they probably have gone to school with blacks. But they moved, I think they moved to a hotel to have the thing done rather than at City Hall where the mayor would take a picture with them. Those things happen. There were other things that happened that people just, you wouldn't even begin to think about it. For instance, the hotel banquet halls. Let's take the old Roosevelt. Was a wonderful gathering place in their banquet hall. And I didn't realize this until I started traveling nationally. We usually had all black waiters. Just think about that, all black male waiters worked the Whitney. I'm not saying they weren't a whiter here too. They were not segregated in that sense. They might have had a couple of whites, but they were basically black waiters. That's what they did. They were trained, and they were good. When I traveled nationally, I found that in many of the hotels, it was white women who were the waiters. It seems strange to me. You understand that? Got women serving the tables because you're going to this hotel, others here. We just had a big core of black service. Then I want you to think about this, that there are many people serving those jobs who are moonlighting. And they were, I don't know the number, but I know it happened on any number of occasions. They were professors or teachers, either in high school or principal of a high school or a professor at Dillard, a professor at Xavier, that was moonlighting as a waiter. So as long as they were serving all white people, they did not know who was sitting at that table, and the white people didn't know that this person was who he was. Okay, so now we've got black guests sitting at the table, young black guests, because the kids from Koo, I say kids, they 25, 28, 30 years old, they're now, my staff people are coming and sitting at these banquet tables, and so were other people. We're not the only ones, but let's just assume we were there. Now a professor who taught you at school is now serving you as a waiter. Does that kind of make you think a little bit?
And these are not just Mardi Gras organizations. These
No,
are banquets of
any
all
kind,
kinds.
any kind of banquet.
Yeah.
Any kind of banquet. Urban League, but not Urban League, but because that would have been African American. But yeah, I guess they ran a problem too. If you had an Urban League banquet and you were a waiter and you were part of the group, I mean, blacks had to make a living wherever they could make a living. and moonlighting was a big deal. The one incident that I remember with such vivid, joyful recollection was because we asked people, and I was not mayor at this time, to please invite people as guests. I went to Joe Canizaro's home at a party, and I was out of the mayor's office at the time, but it was part of the pattern.
This was after you were mayor?
After I was mayor. It was just within 6 months after I was mayor. And Joe had a party at his house out on Metairie Road, a big, beautiful home, and I'm nothing but praise for Joe Canizaro and his wife. They were great hosts, wonderful. But Vern and I walked in the door, and I noticed, oh, come on, brain. Can you stop that for a minute? Or let me think.
It's okay. It's blank.
Oh, you can clip it out. I don't care.
Yeah.
Is this someone,
Yeah.
you saw someone or you didn't see someone?
Yeah. Oh, it's just that my memory for names slips sometimes. He's president of Liberty Bank,
Alden McDonald?
Alden McDonald. Alden was a guest at the
Way
party.
back on?
Alden was a guest, he and his wife were a guest at the party. And when Vern and I walked in, the party had already begun, and in a very brief period of time, I saw the waiter come out and offering people drinks and hors d'oeuvres, and I noticed the waiter was Alden's father, who was the #1 butler in town, who was the chief butler at the Boston Club. So Joe Canizaro, and putting on a nice party, had hired Mr. McDonald to serve this party of all very nice, upscale, financially upscale people. And it just struck me as so strange that Mr. McDonald would be serving at the party that his son was an honored guest. So I walked in the kitchen, saw Mr. McDonald, said, "You must be very proud of your son." He said, "I am, Mr. Mayor, I really am." I knew Mr. McDonald well, thought highly of him. And later on, I told Joe, I said, "Joe, you did it first." He said, "What was that?" I told him, he almost dropped dead. He said,
He didn't know.
"I can't believe that." No, he didn't. He did not know Mr. McDonald was Alden's. Why would he know? Why would he know? I mean, it's one of those quirky things.
But that kind of awkward incident couldn't have happened unless there had been progress in that decade.
Well, of course. I mean, once you started that, the whole point of the story is, as you integrated society with white society not knowing black society, and black society not knowing white society, it wasn't as if a starting pistol clapped and the two merged. It didn't happen, and it still is not fully there. But it happened, and in the happening, these unforeseen consequences come up, like the college professor serving the table where his previous student is sitting, Mr. McDonald and his son. I mean, these stories can be repeated over and over again. These are only the ones I saw with my eyes. How many of them happened out there in this city? Integrating the government was not easy, but there was a pathway. The social integration has been far more difficult. We have made great strides, I don't question that, but clearly there is still a long way to go. And that doesn't mean that everybody has to sacrifice who they are. I don't expect the young men of Illinois and the Bunch Club to become 50% white and 50% black, or Rex or any other group to do that. There is an identity, a historical basis. I mean, Xavier's always going to be an historical black college, but it has a significant percentage of whites. Loyola University is a Catholic institution, but I would guess 30% of the students are not Catholic. Maybe in 10 years, 40% of the students will be not Catholic. I don't know what the percentage is. I just read a story on Marymount in New York Times the other day, the problem they're having with this thing switching, and how do you maintain your Catholicity? Well, it's not just Catholic, it's any institution. You are what you are, otherwise you become generic. And you're confronted with issues. If you're Loyola University and half your faculty is not Catholic, what do you do about prayer and Mass, and what do you do about health provisions that cover this and don't cover that? And that big argument is on birth control right now about what Catholic institutions have to provide that in the insurance. Well, I know it's a little off path of what we're talking about, but it's true in all social structures and businesses. There are established patterns, and they're moved gradually and slowly. You know, we're talking about African Americans here. We've said very little about women. But if you take a look at the fact is there were very few women in policy positions in City Hall before. I think we made significant changes in the 70s, but we were nowhere near where we should have been when we finished. Mm-hmm. We were more preoccupied with the racial thing than with the feminine thing, though I was constantly aware of it, and we did move women into important policy decisions, particularly in City Hall. They were always on boards and commissions and things, but in power positions in City Hall.
Why do you think that was? Were you getting more pressure on racial issues than on
It was just in my
issues?
mind more. It was focused. It's where the focus was, where I thought the desperate need was. I mean, listen, we did some wonderful things with, you take Miss Freiberg, Miss Stitch, they were running the People's Helpers and the information stuff. I mean, no, it wasn't department head, but it was in a way more important than the department. And Mary Z for one, and who was head of the Parkway Commission, and
Mildred Fossier?
Mildred Fauché, and so we made progress there. The 70s made progress there, and you know, my daughter is a United States Senator. I'm looking at the picture on the wall. Their numbers have been growing. She's been there now for 16 years, and it's ever so slight. Another one here, another one there. Are they close to equality? Not close. Not close. But it's getting there. Now, I don't know that will ever happen in our social structure in a Mardi Gras organization. And women are not going to become captains of Rex. They're not going to become officers in Rex. It's a male thing in that way. And then there are separate female organizations that have formed. There's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. Is it fine racially? I think not really. No, not racially. I don't think it's fine. But people can do what they choose to do. But the husband, wife, daughter thing is entirely different than white male, black male, white male, female, right? Very different. and it's a question of some social justice. Now, that does not mean to me that people can't have their own own social clubs. But I think it's fading as something of the past.
Before we leave the Landrieu administration in the 1970s, in your first term, there are a couple of incidents that could have been speed bumps to racial harmony in New Orleans. I mean, I'm thinking of the Black Panther standoff in your first year in office, your first months in office in the Desire neighborhood. And
I was in office less than 6 months when the first Panther
and I'm
confrontation
also thinking
started.
of Mark Essex, the young man who,
Right.
a black former Navy member who shot from the Howard Johnson and killed people. Those in other cities, those could have become racial incidents. How did we avoid it here?
We were just very lucky. First of all, New Orleans is a different place. I just marvel at the difference in this city and other cities across America. We had no turmoil while cities were burning all over America. We had none of that in New Orleans. And one person told me one day, well, Moon, I said, why? And they said, you don't do it to your kin, you know. I mean, and we're all interrelated. I really don't, I really can't explain to say we were lucky. And the Panther shootout was very difficult and could have been terribly disastrous. It was still troublesome racially, but the aftermath worked out fine. There were no deaths. The Panthers had occupied a piece of property on the edge of the Desire Project, and I won't take you through the whole thing. It'll take me an hour. And wouldn't pay rent, and ran up their flag and claimed the property as their own. And the owner of that property came to City Hall, and I wanted to see him because I heard it was rippling out there. And he wanted them evicted. So I said for him to go to court, get an eviction decree, and we would enforce the decree if the court gave him an eviction. If the court's personnel couldn't do it, we would be there to support them. Well, somebody threw the eviction notice up on the porch. That's as far as they got. But before we got to evicting them, there were two officers that the police chief had put in as undercover people in their group. They discovered them and beat the devil out of them, almost killed them. And they left. When they did that, obviously they'd committed a serious felony. And we ordered the chief ordered the police to go in with my full approval and evict them. And they were barricaded in with all kinds of weapons. We brought the state armored car down here, whatever it is. It's an armored vehicle. And God knows how many shots they fired at this house and got fired back at. Nobody was killed, and eventually they surrendered. That night, the police had heard that there was going to be they were going to burn that man's store down. His house was next to a store. So they'd put a couple of police inside the store. The story thereafter is very mixed and confused because they shot somebody out in the street, which they thought was coming to burn the house down.
The police shot.
Yeah, and the story is it's not true. I don't know if anybody will ever find the full truth. Everybody knows exactly what happened, but nobody can really, with any degree of certainty, I think. There are a lot of different truths out there depending upon what side you're on and where you saw it from. So a couple of people were killed At least one I know. I think several were. The Panthers got out of jail and then went and occupied a apartment in the Desire Project itself, and without authority. So we started with the eviction process again against them. And the police moved out there in great force to evict him, but many of the youths in the project stood between the police and us. I was following it on the radio, on the police radio and stuff, and I instructed Clarence Jeruso, the chief of police, to withdraw his troops from that project before we had any massive manslaughter, killing. The police were terribly unhappy, but I went back to City Hall to greet them when they came off the buses in all their battle gear and uniform, and a lot of them were spitting at me, so to speak, if not physically and with their eyes, and murmurs. But I knew that if we stayed there with these children between those officers and we stayed there at night, somebody was going to get killed. So the police were terribly unhappy with me. They felt it was a retreat. They had to retreat. Their pride was hurt and everything. I don't know how many weeks later, I got a call from the chief of police and told me that intelligence picked up that they were going to leave town on a bus provided by this movie actress, what's her name? Jane Fonda, who had given them 2 or 3 buses or something to take them to Washington, D.C. to a rally. This was the Black Panther movement, which was self-defined revolutions. And the chief said, you know, told me what his plan was of arresting him and wanted to get clearance to go ahead and arrest all these people. And I said, absolutely, do it. So they put up let them get on the road and then stopped them as they tried to get on the interstate system. But there were people left at home in that project. And he told me that he had a method for getting them out of there. He was had a secret plan to snooker them out. I did not know. I knew the general theme of it. I did not know he was going to use a priest garb to do it. And that's the only defense I'll put up. I did not know that he was going to use a priest garb. So he dressed somebody as a postman and somebody as a priest, and they went up to the door and somehow got their way in there. A couple of shots fired, but nobody was hit. Again, I guess we're just lucky. And they were arrested, and that represents the end of the Panther incident. The Howard Johnson thing was different.
Now, on the Panther, can I ask on the Panther
Yeah.
incident, if there had been any violence, well, why didn't the Panther standoff and the Panther stand in New Orleans inflame anyone else?
You mean other blacks too?
Yeah, anyone else in the community?
Well, I don't know if they've done that anywhere else in the country.
Right.
I don't know that they've inflamed any general uprising of a revolution. So I don't think New Orleans was exceptional in that. I will tell you that New Orleans is different. There were lots of complaints about the Desire Project. It was terrible. It was overcrowded. It was not well kept. It was a federal property. We had tried to resolve the issue. I had sent a number of my staff down there to talk to the Panthers to see if we couldn't talk them out. I met with ministers who, on the second occasion when they were in the project itself, a conglomeration of ministers and priests who formed a clique. I don't know whether there were 3 or 4 or 5 of them. Went to meet with them to see if we couldn't peacefully get them out. They would not leave. They were not interested in negotiations. This was who they were, and this was their place, and they were staying.
But you did have black staff members already at this point.
Well, not only
And
had black staff members, Jack,
But
but
you had-
I
you-
sent them down to talk to the
Right.
Panthers.
You had people who were already on your staff, and you had your relationship with Soul, so that you did have people who you could use to communicate,
Of course.
which wouldn't have happened. The point I
Johnny
was making.
Jackson, I went and met with some of the Black Panthers at Johnny Jackson's place. Johnny later became a councilman down there, but he was in the Desire area, and I went. And there was some question as to whether I should or not from a security standpoint, but I'm not a brave man, but I thought it was worth the risk, and I went and met with them, and you just couldn't move them. There was no interest in anything except meeting their demands, of which were totally, I'm not saying they were socially undesirable, but were just totally unreachable. I mean, it was now,
Yeah.
freedom now, everything, and the bullet of the gun, and so eventually it came to a head with police action that was necessary. Now I'm telling you, we were lucky. We were patient. We tried to be smart, but we were also very fortunate. In the shootout of the Howard Johnson, a sniper shot an officer, Mr. Hosley, I hope I have the name correctly, out at police headquarters, was in the garage or on the grounds of the garage and got killed by a sniper. And then sometimes later, the sniper entered the Howard Johnson Hotel and started putting rooms on fire and shooting people. And eventually found his way to the top of the building and began to shoot people, well, not when he got on the top necessarily, but when he was in the hotel, shoot the firemen who came to put out the fires. And my memory is a little vague on how many were shot, a number were killed. Eventually, I authorized them to get a helicopter from the Army. It's a question about violating the Posse Comitatus Act by using military pilot and military equipment to quell a civil disturbance. It's a well understood doctrine. And they eventually, from that helicopter, shot him and killed him on the roof. There are great conspiracy theories all over the place about how many people there were. Well, it was just part of a larger conspiracy. Others evaporated in the neighborhoods. But history has shown, and we knew at the time, very shortly afterwards, there was only one person. He created a havoc, there's no question. But it was only one person by himself. And that we end of that. The other one had no racial overtones at all, was the Rout fire. Then we had the Uptown fire too, which had some overtones. They recently celebrated, if not celebrated, at least had a remembrance for the Uptown fire where...
The upstairs lounge.
Yeah, where so many gays were burned and killed. And some people said, well, neither the governor nor the mayor expressed a word of sympathy. I don't know what to say about that. I'm fairly certain I was in Europe at the time it happened. Vern and I had taken a trip with some friends, and we were in Europe. That doesn't mean we couldn't have sent back a message of condolence or something. And whether anybody on the staff did anything, I don't know. But of course, it was a terrible tragedy, and I've expressed great regrets at it. It's a horrible thing, whether it happened then or now. I'm not a newcomer to this scene, but at least I know they fell on a TV show, said something about us not doing the appropriate, showing the appropriate regrets or so forth. But
that was said recently.
I'm pretty sure that I was in Europe at the time it happened. Doesn't mean I couldn't have done it when I came back. It just wasn't there.
Well, as usual, we've gone through 2 hours, and I could ask you many more questions.
Well, we can set another time if you'd like.
But we
to.
could,
You all like-
I think if it's, again, acceptable to you, we'd like to continue in at least another session, maybe more.
Fine.
We might
can-
not hit the 10 sessions that
We
you
can do it.
suggested, but I think if this
Well,
is.
the only problem is that some of this comes out like I. I don't intend it to do that, and I didn't do it for this purpose. Some of it, I can't speak of it otherwise, because I'm the only actor. But the main thing is what was different, and I think the 70s, piece all this together, the 70s were different. Now, the 60s were different, the 50s were different, the 90s are different. There was a sea change that took place in the 70s, and I'm sure other things can be mentioned. I mean, the physical improvements that were started. So and you know, it's a time of the 70s, which the 60s, this is one of the important things people have to remember about movements. The 60s were, in this country, the most socially dominant change period ever. But most of it was demonstrations, rallies, and some action by the federal government. But it takes time for all that to get implemented. So it doesn't happen instantaneously, just as school integration, and which is a great lesson from 54. We didn't integrate Catholic schools till 62. That's 8 years later, after the Supreme Court has ruled. The Supreme Court wasn't ruling about the Catholic schools, but public schools didn't start till 60. So that's 6 years, even under the law. So social change is slow to take place. So although these laws were passed in the 60s, we're now seeing them fulfilled in the 70s, the federal law.
Well, so we have more to talk about.
Well, we have a lot to talk about.
So I would like to come back.
All right,
if that's
Jack,
okay
whatever
with
you say.
If that's okay with you.
Okay with me.
And thank you so much. This was very, very helpful.
All right, Jack, fine. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.